There comes a moment in a man's life when everything he once relied on begins to slip through his hands, when the voices that used to surround him fade into silence, and the presence of people he once called his own slowly disappears. It doesn't happen all at once. It's quiet, almost unnoticeable at first. The messages become less frequent, the concern becomes distant, and the warmth he once felt from others turns cold. He tries to hold on, tries to convince himself that it's just a phase, that things will go back to how they were, but deep down, he knows something has changed. The world that once felt familiar now feels empty, and the loneliness begins to settle in a way he's never experienced before. He walks through his days carrying a weight he cannot explain, smiling when he has to, speaking when necessary. But inside, there's a silence that echoes louder than any noise around him. In those moments, he starts to question everything: his worth, his purpose, his place in the lives of others. He replays conversations in his mind, wondering where it all went wrong, wondering if he wasn't enough, if he gave too much, or maybe not enough at all. The nights become the hardest when there are no distractions left, when the darkness forces him to face the thoughts he tries to escape during the day. It's in those quiet hours that the truth becomes undeniable. The people he thought would always be there are gone, and the support he once leaned on is no longer within reach. He feels abandoned, not just by others, but almost by life itself, as if everything he believed in has turned its back on him. And yet, in the middle of that emptiness, something shifts. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but gently, like a whisper breaking through the noise of his thoughts. When a man reaches the point where he has no one left to turn to, no shoulder to lean on, no voice to reassure him, he begins to look beyond everything he once depended on. It's not out of strength at first, but out of desperation, out of a need to find something, anything, that can hold him together. And that's when he lifts his head, not toward people, not toward the world, but toward something greater, something constant, something that was always there, even when he wasn't paying attention. Because when a man has no one left, when the world has stripped him of every distraction and every false sense of security, he is left with a truth that cannot be taken away from him. He still has God. And in that realization, as painful as the journey is, as heavy as his heart may feel, he begins to understand that this moment, this breaking point, is not the end of him. It is the beginning of something deeper, something real, something that will redefine who he is from the inside out. And when that realization settles in, when he understands that all he truly has left is God, life doesn't suddenly become easier. In fact, it often feels like everything begins to fall apart all at once. It's as if the ground beneath him, which he once believed was solid, starts to crack without warning. And no matter how hard he tries to hold it together, things keep slipping through his fingers. The plans he carefully built no longer make sense. The people he once trusted become distant memories, and the future he once imagined begins to blur into uncertainty. There is a deep ache in that process, a kind of pain that isn't loud but constant, sitting heavy on his chest, reminding him that something has been lost, something he can't easily replace. He starts to see that the life he was holding on to so tightly was never as secure as he believed, and that realization alone is enough to shake him to his core. He tries, of course, to fix it. A man always tries first. He reaches out, hoping someone will respond the way they used to, hoping someone will notice the weight he's carrying and step in before he completely breaks. But the responses are different now, shorter, colder, sometimes not there at all. And with every unanswered call, every ignored message, every moment of silence where there should have been support, something inside him begins to shift. It's not just disappointment anymore. It becomes acceptance, a quiet understanding that the people he once leaned on are no longer part of his journey in the way they used to be. That acceptance doesn't come easily. It comes with frustration, with confusion, with nights where he questions everything about himself and everything about the world around him. In those moments, he begins to confront a truth most people spend their lives avoiding: that not everyone is meant to stay, and not everything that feels permanent actually is. The roles people played in his life start to make more sense, not as lifelong companions, but as temporary presences. lessons, seasons, chapters that were never meant to last forever. And while that realization brings clarity, it also brings a kind of loneliness that words can barely capture. Because it's one thing to understand why people leave, but it's another thing entirely to feel their absence in the quiet moments, to notice the empty spaces where laughter once lived, to sit with memories that no longer have a place in his present. As everything around him continues to fall apart, he also begins to see parts of himself he never noticed before. Without the noise of others, without the distractions of constant connection, he is left alone with his thoughts, his fears, and his truth. There is no one to impress anymore, no one to perform for, no one to validate his worth. And that can feel terrifying at first, because it forces him to face the question he's been avoiding for so long. Who is he when there is no one else around? Not the version of himself shaped by expectations, not the one built on approval or attention, but the real, unfiltered version of who he truly is. And sometimes that version feels unfamiliar, even uncomfortable, because it carries both his strength and his brokenness at the same time. The breaking point doesn't come in one dramatic moment. It builds slowly, piece by piece, until he can no longer ignore it. It shows up in the exhaustion he feels from trying to hold everything together, in the quiet tears he doesn't let anyone see, in the moments where he sits in silence, staring at nothing, feeling everything. It's in that space, where everything seems to be collapsing, that he begins to understand something deeper about life, that sometimes things don't fall apart to destroy him. They fall apart to reveal what was never truly stable to begin with. The relationships that couldn't withstand hardship, the dreams that were built on shaky foundations, the versions of himself that depended too much on others. All of it starts to crumble, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. And still, despite how heavy it feels, despite how lost he may seem, there is something quietly forming within him. It's not obvious at first, and it doesn't come with immediate relief, but it's there. A subtle shift in the way he begins to see things. The pain is still present, but it no longer feels meaningless. The loneliness is still real, but it starts to carry a different kind of weight, one that pushes him inward rather than breaking him completely. Because when everything falls apart, when there is nothing left to rely on externally, he is left with only two choices: to collapse under the weight of it all, or to start rebuilding from a place that cannot be shaken. And that's where the presence of God begins to feel different. Not distant, not abstract, but real in a way he never noticed before. Because when people leave and plans fail and everything he depended on disappears, he begins to realize that there is still something holding him together, something unseen but undeniable. In the silence, in the emptiness, in the moments where he feels like he's at his lowest, there is a quiet strength that doesn't come from him alone. It doesn't remove the pain instantly. It doesn't fix everything overnight, but it steadies him just enough to keep going, just enough to take another step when he feels like stopping. And so even as everything falls apart around him, something within him refuses to completely break. Not because he is unhurt, not because he is unaffected, but because somewhere deep inside, he is beginning to understand that this collapse is not the end of his story. It is the stripping away of everything that was temporary, everything that was uncertain, everything that kept him from seeing what truly matters. It is painful, yes, and it tests him in ways he never expected, but it also prepares him for something greater, something built not on people, not on circumstances, but on a foundation that cannot be taken away. Because when a man stands in the middle of everything falling apart and realizes that he still has God, he is no longer as lost as he thought he was. He may feel broken, he may feel alone, but he is not without direction. In fact, he is being guided, even if he cannot see it yet, toward a version of himself that is stronger, deeper, and more grounded than anything he has ever known. And that is the quiet truth hidden within the chaos. That sometimes everything has to fall apart so that the right things can finally come together. And as everything continues to settle into silence, that loneliness no longer feels like just a passing phase. It becomes a space he is forced to live in, a space that begins to shape him in ways he never expected. At first, he resists it, trying to fill the emptiness with distractions, with noise, with anything that can keep him from feeling the full weight of being alone. But nothing truly works for long, because this kind of loneliness is different. It doesn't disappear when the day gets busy or when the world gets loud. It follows him, sits with him, and waits for the moment when everything slows down again, reminding him that there is no one left to lean on the way he once did. And in that constant presence, he slowly begins to change, not because he wants to, but because he has no other choice. He starts noticing things he used to ignore, truths he once avoided, patterns in people and in himself that were hidden behind comfort and connection. Without anyone around to distract him, he is left alone with his thoughts, and those thoughts begin to dig deeper than surface-level emotions. He reflects on the relationships that didn't last, the moments he gave too much of himself, the times he stayed when he should have walked away, and the times he walked away when he should have stayed. There is a painful clarity in that reflection, a kind of honesty that only loneliness can bring, because there is no one else there to soften the truth or to help him escape it. And while that truth can hurt, it also begins to free him in a quiet, almost unnoticed way. In that solitude, he begins to understand that not all loneliness is meant to break him. Some of it is meant to rebuild him. Because when there is no one else to depend on, he starts learning how to stand on his own, how to face his fears without running, how to sit with discomfort without immediately trying to escape it. It's not easy, and it doesn't happen overnight, but slowly, piece by piece, he becomes more aware of himself, more grounded in who he is rather than who others expected him to be. The need for constant validation starts to fade. The desire to be understood by everyone begins to lose its urgency, and in its place comes a quiet strength that doesn't rely on external approval. And somewhere in that process, his connection with God begins to deepen in a way he never experienced before. It's no longer just something he turns to in moments of desperation. It becomes a constant presence, something he leans on not out of habit, but out of understanding. Because when a man has no one else to talk to, he begins to speak more honestly, more openly, without fear of judgment or rejection. His prayers are no longer perfect or rehearsed. They are raw, real, and filled with everything he's been holding inside. And in that honesty, he starts to feel heard in a way that no human connection ever fully provided. The loneliness is still there, but it begins to feel different. It's no longer just emptiness. It becomes a space where he grows, where he heals, where he learns what truly matters. It teaches him patience, resilience, and the kind of inner peace that cannot be taken away by people coming or going. And as much as it once felt like a punishment, he begins to see it as a turning point, a necessary chapter that is shaping him into someone stronger, someone wiser, someone who no longer fears being alone, because he understands that being alone does not mean being abandoned. Because in that loneliness, he discovers something powerful, that the absence of people can sometimes be the very thing that brings him closer to who he was meant to become, and closer to the one who never left him in the first place. And as that loneliness begins to settle into something he can no longer run from, his heart slowly starts turning toward the only place that still feels steady, the only presence that hasn't shifted or disappeared, and that is when God stops being just a distant belief and becomes his only real support. At first, it doesn't come from strength, it comes from exhaustion, from reaching the point where he has tried everything else and found nothing that could truly hold him together. There are no more people left to impress, no expectations to meet, no masks to wear, and in that raw and unguarded state, he begins to speak to God in a way he never has before. Not with perfect words or memorized prayers, but with honesty, with vulnerability, with the kind of truth that only comes from a heart that has been broken and stripped of everything it once relied on. He starts to realize that this connection feels different from anything he has known, because it does not depend on responses, moods, or conditions. It does not fade when things get difficult, and it does not disappear when he is at his lowest. Instead, it meets him exactly where he is, in his confusion, in his pain, in his moments of doubt, and slowly it begins to steady him from within. He may not see immediate changes in his situation, and the struggles around him may still exist, but something inside him starts to shift in a way that cannot be easily explained. There is a calm that begins to grow beneath the chaos, a quiet strength that carries him even when he feels like he has nothing left to give. As he continues to lean on God, not out of routine but out of genuine need, he begins to understand that true support is not always about removing problems, but about giving him the strength to face them. The desperation that once filled his prayers starts to transform into trust, and the fear that once controlled his thoughts begins to lose its grip. He no longer looks for validation in people the way he used to, because he has found a deeper sense of worth that does not depend on anyone's approval. And even though he still walks through life without the same crowd he once had, he no longer feels as empty as before, because he knows he is not walking alone. There are moments, of course, when the old feelings try to return, when the silence feels heavy again and the absence of people becomes noticeable, but now he responds differently. Instead of breaking under it, he turns toward God with a deeper sense of connection, with a growing confidence that he is being held even when he cannot see it. And in those moments, he starts to realize that what he once saw as abandonment was actually an invitation to build a relationship that is not temporary, not fragile, but constant and unshakable. And as this connection strengthens, it begins to reflect in the way he carries himself, in the way he thinks, in the way he responds to life. He becomes less reactive, less dependent on external circumstances, and more grounded in something that cannot be taken away. Because when God becomes his only support, he is no longer defined by who stays or who leaves, by what he has or what he has lost, but by a deeper understanding that his strength is no longer coming from the world around him, but from something far greater within him, something that remains even when everything else falls away. And as he continues to lean on that unseen strength, something within him begins to change in a way that is quiet yet undeniable, as if the very weight that once tried to break him is now reshaping him into someone he has never been before. This transformation does not happen all at once, and it does not come with dramatic signs or sudden perfection, but it unfolds slowly in the way he starts to think, in the way he carries his pain, and in the way he no longer reacts to life the same way he once did. The man who used to seek constant reassurance now finds himself becoming more self-assured, not because he has all the answers, but because he is no longer shaken by every uncertainty. The things that once disturbed his peace begin to lose their power over him, and the noise of the world, which once felt overwhelming, starts to fade into the background as he becomes more anchored in something deeper. He begins to notice that his priorities are shifting without him even forcing them to change, that the things he once chased so desperately no longer hold the same importance. The need for approval, the fear of being alone, the constant desire to be understood by everyone, these things slowly start to fall away, replaced by a sense of clarity that feels both new and familiar at the same time. It is as if he is returning to a version of himself that was always there, but buried under expectations, disappointments, and the opinions of others. And while this new version of him is stronger, it is also more peaceful, less driven by ego, and more guided by purpose. There is a certain calm that begins to settle within him, not because life has become easier, but because he has become stronger in how he faces it. He no longer feels the need to chase people who do not choose him, nor does he feel the urge to prove his worth to those who cannot see it. Instead, he walks with a quiet confidence, understanding that what is meant for him will not require him to lose himself in the process. And even in moments where things still feel uncertain, he no longer panics the way he used to, because he has learned that not every unanswered question is a threat. Sometimes it is simply part of the path he is meant to walk. This transformation also changes the way he sees his past, the pain, the loss, the moments that once felt like failures. Instead of carrying them as burdens, he begins to understand them as lessons, as necessary experiences that shaped the strength he now carries. What once felt like rejection starts to look like redirection, and what once felt like endings begins to reveal itself as beginnings in disguise. And with that understanding, he starts to let go, not just of people or situations, but of the version of himself that was tied to them. And as he continues to grow into this new mindset, he realizes that the transformation is not about becoming someone completely different, but about becoming more of who he was always meant to be. A man who is not easily shaken by circumstances. A man who does not depend on others to feel whole. A man whose strength comes from within and whose peace is rooted in something greater than the world around him. And in that realization, he understands that everything he went through, every moment of loneliness, every time he felt like he was falling apart, was not there to destroy him, but to refine him, to strip away everything unnecessary so that what remains is real, strong, and unbreakable. And as he continues to grow into this new version of himself, he begins to look back at everything he lost with a different perspective, one that no longer sees those moments as pure pain, but as part of a deeper plan he couldn't understand at the time. He starts to realize that not every departure was meant to hurt him, even though it did, and not every ending was meant to break him, even though it felt like it would. There is a quiet understanding that begins to settle in his heart, a realization that sometimes God removes people not as a punishment, but as a form of protection, as a way of clearing paths he could not see, were leading him in the wrong direction. And although that truth doesn't erase the memories or the emotions attached to them, it begins to bring a sense of peace that replaces the confusion he once carried. He reflects on the connections he once held onto so tightly, the ones he thought he couldn't live without, and he starts to see how some of them were slowly draining him, holding him back, or keeping him tied to versions of himself he was meant to outgrow. At the time, he couldn't see it, because emotions often cloud clarity, and attachment can make even the wrong things feel right. But distance has a way of revealing truth, and what once felt like loss now starts to look like necessary separation. He begins to understand that not everyone who walks into his life is meant to stay forever, and that some people are only there for a season, to teach, to challenge, or to redirect him towards something greater. There is also a deeper layer to this realization, one that touches his sense of purpose, because sometimes the people around him were not just distractions, but obstacles to the growth he was meant to experience. Their presence made him comfortable when he was meant to be challenged, kept him stagnant when he was meant to evolve, or encouraged parts of him that were not aligned with the man he was becoming. And in removing them, God was not taking something valuable away, but making space for something better, something that aligns with his true path, even if he could not see it yet. He begins to see that what he once called rejection was often redirection, that the doors that closed were not meant for him to force open, and that the relationships that ended were not meant for him to chase. There is a kind of freedom in that understanding, because it releases him from the need to hold on to things that are no longer meant for him, and it allows him to trust that what is truly his will not require him to fight against its absence. And even though there are still moments where he remembers what he lost, where the past tries to pull him back into old feelings, he now has the awareness to see it differently, to remind himself that if something was removed from his life, there was a reason beyond what he could immediately understand. And as that trust continues to grow, he no longer fears losing people the way he once did, because he knows that his life is not defined by who stays or who leaves. Instead, he becomes more focused on who he is becoming, on the path he is walking, and on the presence that has remained constant through it all. Because when he truly understands why God removes people, he no longer sees it as abandonment, but as alignment, not as loss, but as preparation for something greater than he could have held on to if those people had never left. And as that understanding settles deeper within him, he begins to experience a kind of strength he has never known before. A strength that does not come from people, approval, or circumstances, but from the simple yet powerful realization that having only God is not a weakness. It is, in fact, his greatest advantage. Because when everything else has been stripped away, when there is no one left to rely on and nothing external to lean on, what remains is something pure, something unshakable, something that cannot be taken from him, no matter how much life changes around him. He starts to walk differently, not with arrogance, but with a quiet confidence that comes from knowing that his foundation is no longer built on temporary things. The fear of losing people begins to fade because he has already faced that reality and survived it. And in surviving it, he has discovered that his strength was never dependent on them to begin with. There is a certain peace that comes with this realization, a peace that doesn't mean life is perfect, but one that means he is no longer easily disturbed by what happens outside of him. Situations that once would have shaken him now feel manageable, not because they are smaller, but because he has become stronger. He no longer seeks constant reassurance or validation, because he understands that his worth is not something others get to define. And even when challenges arise, even when uncertainty tries to creep back in, he does not panic the way he once did, because he knows where his strength comes from, and that knowledge alone is enough to steady him in moments that would have once broken him. Having only God also changes the way he moves through life, the way he makes decisions, the way he views success and failure. He is no longer chasing things just to feel complete, no longer holding on to people out of fear of being alone, and no longer compromising his peace to maintain connections that do not serve him. Instead, he begins to move with intention, with clarity, and with a deeper sense of purpose. Because when a man reaches a point where God is enough, everything else becomes secondary, not unimportant, but no longer necessary for his sense of identity or stability. And in that space, he becomes something rare, someone who is not easily influenced by the opinions of others, someone who does not crumble under pressure, someone who can stand alone without feeling empty. There is a freedom in that, a kind of independence that is not rooted in isolation, but in connection to something greater. He may walk through life without the same circle he once had, without the same level of external support, but he carries within him a source of strength that does not depend on numbers, presence, or constant reassurance. And perhaps the most powerful part of it all is that he no longer fears being alone, because he understands that being alone with God is far more powerful than being surrounded by people who do not truly support or understand him. What once felt like loss now feels like alignment. What once felt like emptiness now feels like space for growth. And what once felt like weakness now reveals itself as strength. Because when a man has only God, he is no longer fragile, no longer easily broken by the changes of life, but grounded, steady, and quietly unstoppable in a way that does not need to be proven to anyone but lived from within. And after everything he has been through, after the loss, the silence, the loneliness, and the rebuilding, there comes a moment where it all finally makes sense, not in a loud or overwhelming way, but in a quiet, deeply personal realization that settles within him like a truth he was always meant to discover. He begins to see his journey not as a series of unfortunate events, but as a path that was carefully shaping him, guiding him, and preparing him for something far greater than he could have understood in the beginning. The pain that once confused him now carries meaning. The losses that once felt unfair now reveal their purpose. And the loneliness that once broke him now stands as the very thing that brought him closer to who he truly is. He realizes that when he had everyone around him, he was often distracted, caught up in expectations, seeking validation, and losing himself in the noise of other people's opinions. He was present, but not fully aware, surrounded, but not deeply connected to what truly mattered. And it was only when all of that was taken away, when the distractions were stripped from his life, that he was able to see clearly, to hear his own thoughts, and to recognize the presence that had been with him all along. What once felt like emptiness now reveals itself as clarity, as if the silence was not meant to isolate him, but to help him finally listen. There is a certain humility that comes with this realization, a quiet acceptance that he did not lose everything by accident, and that the moments he once resisted were actually leading him exactly where he needed to be. He understands now that God was not distant during his struggles, nor was he abandoned in his lowest moments. In fact, those were the moments where he was being guided the most, even if he could not see it at the time. And that understanding changes everything, because it replaces doubt with trust, fear with faith, and confusion with a sense of direction that no longer depends on having all the answers. He begins to let go of the need to control everything, to force outcomes, or to hold on to people and situations that are not meant for him. There is a peace in surrender, in accepting that what is meant to stay will stay, and what is meant to leave will do so for a reason beyond his immediate understanding. And instead of fighting that process, he starts to flow with it, trusting that every step, every delay, every closed door is part of something greater than his current perspective can fully grasp. And in that final realization, he understands something that changes the way he sees himself and his life forever. That losing people did not make him weaker. It revealed his strength. That being alone did not mean he was abandoned. It meant he was being drawn closer to something real, and that having only God was never something to fear, but something to value. Because in the end, he did not just survive the journey. He was transformed by it, shaped into someone who no longer depends on the temporary, but stands firmly in something eternal. And with that understanding, he no longer looks back with regret or forward with fear, but stands firmly in the present, grounded, aware, and at peace with the path he has walked. Because now he knows that when he thought he was losing everything, he was actually being given the one thing that would never leave him. And in finding that, he didn't just find strength, he finally found himself. And as this final realization sinks deeper, he begins to understand that life's greatest lessons often come wrapped in moments of solitude and struggle, that the experiences which once seemed like punishments were, in reality, the shaping tools of something far greater. Every tear, every heartbreak, every moment of feeling abandoned now takes on a new meaning. It was never about loss, but about preparation. He sees that the people who left, the opportunities that vanished, and the paths that seemed closed were all part of a divine orchestration, guiding him toward clarity, growth, and a strength he could never have discovered if life had been easy or predictable. The loneliness that once felt unbearable now feels sacred, because it created the space for him to build an unshakable foundation, a foundation rooted in faith, resilience, and the understanding that his worth and his purpose do not depend on anyone else. He begins to realize that true freedom is not found in the presence of others, but in the absence of dependence on them. When a man has only God, he is no longer held captive by the fear of being alone, the anxiety of rejection, or the need for constant validation. He learns to walk with confidence in silence, to trust without seeing, and to love without expectation. Every setback is no longer a blow, but a lesson. Every closed door becomes a sign pointing him to the right path. The emptiness that once felt heavy now feels expansive, like a canvas upon which he can finally create the life he was meant to live, free from distractions, illusions, and the weight of trying to please the world. And in that sacred space, he begins to notice a transformation not just in circumstance, but in himself. He is calmer, more patient, and more intentional. He speaks less to impress and more to express. He acts less to gain approval and more to honor truth. The man who once feared silence now embraces it, because he has learned that the quiet is where he hears God most clearly, where he understands the patterns of life, and where he discovers the depth of his own heart. The strength he now carries is quiet but undeniable. It does not boast, it does not demand, it simply exists, and that existence is enough. Finally, he understands that being left with only God is not a punishment, but a privilege. It is the ultimate gift because it teaches him self-reliance without arrogance, humility without weakness, and faith without conditions. In losing everything else, he has gained everything that truly matters. And as he stands on this new ground, he is no longer the man who once feared abandonment. He is a man transformed, unbreakable, and alive with a sense of purpose that no circumstance can shake. He knows now that life may still bring challenges, but no challenge can undo the foundation that has been built in the fire of solitude, the quiet of prayer, and the unwavering presence of God. And in this realization, he smiles, not because life is perfect, but because he has discovered the one thing that is, an eternal, unshakable strength that will carry him through every storm, every loss, every unknown, knowing that when all else fades, God remains, and in God, he has everything he will ever truly need.